We have quite a long agenda, but we're going to talk about GXP systems, what we mean by those systems which are regulated by FDA. We'll talk a little bit about regulatory oversight from FDA, and then we'll get into computer system validation, the system development lifecycle, the importance of risk assessment and software categorization, and then we'll get into IQ, OQ, and PQ, and other types of testing. We'll look at the GAM5V model that covers validation. We'll talk a little bit about the use of vendors and contractors to expedite testing. And then we'll get into individual deliverables like the validation plan and test plan, testing protocol, the result deviations, test documentation requirements, the requirements traceability matrix or RTM, the summary report, acceptance and notification of system going into production. And following that, we'll talk a little bit about standard operating procedures, templates, and training, and the importance of periodic review of your validated system. We'll recap and have questions and answers. So let's get started. GXP is defined where X is a variable, so it's a predicate rule from FDA, and as everybody probably knows, it covers good manufacturing practices, good laboratory practices, and good clinical practices. And these are the basic rules on which the computer system validation, which includes testing, are predicated. And what we're talking about with GXP systems are any IT, or that's really applications, or automated systems, systems that control or monitor devices throughout your organization that are used for any type of work related to your pharmaceutical products, biologics products, medical devices, or even tobacco and other FDA-regulated products. So note that tobacco has been added to the mix in 2009 with the Tobacco Control Act. It is now under FDA regulation. And tobacco-related products such as e-liquids and vaping devices have come under FDA control since August of 2016. So it's important to understand that these industries also are now regulated by FDA, and the same guidelines apply. So any of the systems that you have, IT or application or automated systems, have to be validated according to FDA requirements for computer system validation. Examples of areas in your organization, it's everything from developing your products, doing clinical and animal research, manufacturing and storing, and supply chain distribution. And then after your product is on the market, adverse event monitoring and post-marketing surveillance systems. You have systems used to manage all of these areas and the processes included. And so anything that touches product, and that's an FDA term, if it touches product in the sense that it is critical to either identifying the product or tracking it or reporting results about the product, anything you're using for support documentation to show that your product is what it's supposed to be, it's of quality, and that you're able to track it through your supply chain. Examples of the systems would be found some in your laboratory with data acquisition and LIMS, clinical data management systems, adverse event reporting systems, room environmental monitoring systems, animal observation data reporting systems, and those in manufacturing and the supply chain. But note that it's not enough just to validate your system. You have to take into account any interfaces or integration with other systems. So if your particular system does interface to something, you want to make sure that if there's any data coming from that other system, that system is also validated, or at least you've done some kind of intermediary database, perhaps, where you're sending data to an intermediary and then from there taking it into your validated system. In that case, you must at least validate and test the fact that the interface works correctly. Now, the FDA operates on two very key premises, and these are very important, especially with testing. If you didn't document something, you didn't do it. So throughout your testing effort, you're going to make sure that every single event that you act upon, that you are recording, documenting it as you do it. And if you could have committed fraud, you did commit fraud. So there's no recourse such as you're innocent until proven guilty. That doesn't hold up in a court of FDA like it does in a U.S. court of law. And the FDA has recourse. They can issue fines, they can confiscate materials and products, they can shut down any or all of your operations. And a classic example is Schering-Plough's consent decree, which was issued to the company in 1998. That resulted in a $500 million fine, and they were forced to shut down more than one plant. And it was 10 years before they were able to really recover from all of those losses. Now, computer system validation started up with the FDA Blue Book in 1983. And it's very simply stated as the process of assuring that a system does what it purports to do. So you need to make sure it's thoroughly tested and validated to prove that. It's based on the System Development Life Cycle, or SDLC methodology, and that relates to any IT computer systems, to product development, any type of development. You want to make sure you're covering everything from beginning to end, from cradle to grave. And you're going to have rigorous planning involved, some rigorous testing and documentation throughout that process. And it's not enough just to validate your system. You have to maintain it in a validated state. And this is where testing is very important. Now, the SDLC supports all of the requirements for GXP validation. It's integral to the CSV methodology. And you'll start with selecting your system based on requirements. You'll do your implementation, but then you'll maintain it in a validated state until it's retired. The key elements are the functional requirement specification, which tells you what the system has to do, and that's where we talk about proving that a system does what it purports to do. It purports to do whatever it is that you write up in your functional requirement specification. The design specification talks about how those requirements are delivered, and the implementation is involving your custom development or configuration if it's a configurable package, or it might be you're using it out of the box without any ability to do configuration or customization. Whatever the case, you'll be implementing it. And once the system is in place, you need to do testing. So you're going to have a test plan, you're going to execute the protocols, and have documentation to support it. Once it's tested and fully validated, you'll go into operational maintenance and support. And so you now have the obligation to maintain it in a validated state. Part of maintaining it is your disaster recovery program, what happens if the system fails and is not able to support operations. And then periodic review, where at least annually you'll look at your system and look at the change control that's been in place and changes requested throughout the year. And based on those changes, you might have tested at the time, but based on those changes added together, do you need to do any other testing, maybe some end-to-end testing, to show that the system changes didn't impact each other? Finally, you'll retire your system or otherwise dispose of it, and throughout that whole process, you need to make sure the system remains in a validated state and the data stays in a state of maintaining its integrity. Now, risk assessment is very important because the FDA realized they don't have enough resources to go out and look at every company and every GXP system in the company. So what they have asked industry to do, probably in the last dozen years, is to come up with your list, your inventory of GXP systems. And these should be categorized by risk. So whichever ones are the ones that are going to be most critical to your operation, and if they fail, would pose the most risk, those are the systems that you have at the top of the list. So if you have something where its system fails, for example, in manufacturing, and you have a defective product, but you're not able to detect that aberration or whatever it might be wrong with the system, You want to make sure that you have some kind of testing and contingency plan in place to cover yourself. But assess that risk and just ask a simple question: if the system were to fail, what impact would that have on the process or the product? And as a result, what impact would that have on a patient and safety? Identify risk scenarios. Do the what-if analysis to say, what if this system fails? And this is very important in terms of testing because it's your way of best making sure you test for all possibilities. Now, based on each risk scenario, assess what the impact would be. Assess the likelihood that the risk scenario is going to happen. That's the probability. And then determine whether that's detectable. If it did occur, would you know it? And based on all of these together, you're going to come up with a risk priority or risk profile for each type of system. But at the same time, you want to also look at mitigation and how you can mitigate some of those risks, maybe reducing it. So once you prioritize those, you're going to prepare your test rationale, including a prioritized list of those GXP systems, the level of risk assigned to each, and then a rationale for why you're doing the level of testing that's needed to assure the risk is minimized. Now, software categorization is also another way to slice and dice these GXP systems and make sure that you're doing the right testing. So a lot of systems will undergo testing for validation, but you need to know the type or category of system and the level of validation that you would need, the amount of testing that's required. And you determine that based on very specific criteria, and then establish your rationale for your testing, and you start with your requirements and system selection. Now, GAMP5, which is put out by the International Society of Professional Engineers, ISPE, GAMP5 has a guidance for software categorization. And this is a way of making sure you're covering all bases in testing. So at the first category, you have operating systems, things where you're just going to record the manufacturer name, the version number, the model, whatever it might be. These are operating systems. It might be your infrastructure, your hardware platform, things that you would install but don't necessarily require you to do anything beyond the installation. At level 2, we talk about instruments and controllers. Here you might record the installation qualification results. So a lot of people nowadays are doing GoToMeetings and other types of ways of recording what's going on your computer screen. And they use those to actually record the process of installation. But you want to do the data installed, and you want to make sure you capture, if you don't do a video, that you capture screenshots. And this will demonstrate that it was installed properly. You'll see messages coming up from the screen indicating that each step passed. With category 3, these are off-the-shelf software packages. These are things that you're using as is, and it's the very simplest category to validate because you're just going to validate the functionality as a base package. So you're going to have very few, if any, changes that need to be tested and challenged beyond the core package. Now, some software is configured. That's category 4. And that requires a moderate increase in your validation activity and testing. But you'll get some additional functionality out of it with specialized features. And configurable software is really simply giving you a software package that has parameters that can be set in different settings, and you're able to determine how you want to make those parameters, how you want them set. That's your configured system. A customized system in category 5 is where you're actually developing code and adding that into the system, or you're modifying code that's in the system already. There's a much larger increase in testing because you have to make sure that all of these additional requirements that are tailored to your organization are challenged adequately. You might also have a combination of configured and customized software, combination of categories 4 and 5. And this is commonly used today in most FDA-regulated industries. These are most often the types of applications that I come across. Now for testing, once you have your functional requirements specification, and that's documented and it's approved, now you're ready to test your system. And you want to make sure that you've only included the requirements that you're going to test, or that you're going to use, I should say, because you want to make sure you're only testing requirements that you're actually going to use. If you have requirements listed that are not things you're going to do or use in your environment, don't include them because the FDA will expect you to test them. So leave them out of your requirements, but you can have them noted somewhere just so that you know you can turn those features on if you, at some time in the future, need to add them. But of course, if you add them, you'll have to do some testing. Testing starts with installation qualification, IQ. You're making sure the installation is done correctly, that you follow the vendor instructions or specifications, and you're going to make sure all environmental requirements are met. Nowadays, most servers don't require a cold room or air conditioning or anything of that sort, so most environmental requirements are minimal. But you also want to make sure that you have ongoing maintenance and operational instructions available so that once this infrastructure is installed, you're able to maintain it in a validated state. The IQ covers things like hardware, servers. It could cover your operating system, database software, and anything that is a tool or utility that's used or required to be used by your application. Next, we get into operational qualification, or OQ, and this is testing of the core system functionality, making sure that, again, a system does what it purports to do. So here you want to make sure that every requirement is fully tested, and for every requirement you need to have one test script at least to demonstrate that it works properly. In performance qualification, you're not only doing sort of a repeat of the OQ, but you're making sure it's operable in the environment that you are going to be working and used in the way that your users are going to be operating the system. You want to use simulated test data. You want to make sure it's a production simulated environment. So it has to be an environment that is very similar to what your production environment would look like. A copy of it is best. And you want to make sure that you are challenging it to all levels. You're making sure that multiple users are able to log in and use the system concurrently without error. Things like that. You want to make sure that it's thoroughly tested. The difference between OQ and PQ is testing it as you would be using it, not just making sure the package does what it's supposed to do in OQ. For each of these, for OQ and PQ, you want to have test cases written and executed against the requirements or the design specifications. And you want to have a written protocol. So each one of these, IQ, OQ, and PQ, should have a protocol that's approved by your quality organization as the last signature. And that protocol should specify who's doing the work, how it's being done, your rationale for testing, what kind of test data are you going to use, what kind of test scripts are you going to have. The test scripts should all be included and based on the test cases. Now, a test case is really more of a situation or scenario. Test scripts are the actual steps or details as to how you're going to test that case works. And different types of requirements and specifications are subject to different kinds of testing. So in an IQ, you're verifying that the system was designed properly. The hardware and software components, separate from the application, are all designed properly and functioning properly. In OQ, you're verifying that every functional requirement that you laid out in the beginning is met and that the design elements are correct in terms of delivering that functional capability. The PQ is verifying the user requirement specification, that the user is able to use this system in their operating environment using their same processes and being successful. And the test approach should be set forth in a test plan. So you want to make sure that you have your test protocols or plans done for each of these phases. You also want to make sure that if you do have custom code, you have some unit and integration testing done by whoever is doing the coding prior to your OQ. So you may have developers in-house, you may be using outside resources, but if they are developing code, they should do some unit testing, integration testing, and make sure that that code is working successfully before it's introduced into your test environment. And you should have those results available. You should have some kind of at least statement from a vendor. If it's a contract set of resources, you want to make sure you have some kind of output to show it was done. And the same for IQ. If your vendor is doing your IQ, you want to make sure you have a copy of the results. Now, IQ and OQ can be done by an outside source. It can be done by a vendor. And you can purchase IQ and OQ packages that would include protocols and test scripts and scenarios for the OQ. You want to make sure that if you've done that, that you're using a vendor that you've audited at least every other year, that that vendor is one that is going to deliver against FDA compliance requirements, and that you've also made sure you have the right documentation in place. PQ must be done by your own company. So your users, your subject matter experts, are typically the ones that will execute the PQ. This cannot be done by an outside source. The GAN5V model is one that allows you to see the connections across the whole stream of validation deliverables. When you start, you have your validation plan, which is your validation rationale for how you're going to go about validating and testing your system and why. Your validation plan should include that risk assessment. It should include a statement saying what you think is the particular risk level or profile for that system and why you're testing it the way you are. Your user requirement specification is typically the high-level user language set of requirements. In other words, I want the system to be able to collect data, or I want the system to report the results of a chromatography run. Whatever that might be, it's in user-based language. You take those, and based on the input from your subject matter experts, develop the functional requirement specification, which is a much more detailed level and detailed specification. A functional requirement specification might go down to a level of, I want to collect samples that are running on this particular instrument, and they are going to be within certain specifications as far as upper and lower limits for results. And you want to also make sure you capture the username and identity of the person doing the test. There are a whole lot of other details that you want to put in there. The system design spec is the configuration or specification document that you'll most likely get from either a vendor, or if you do have internal resources doing development, they will also give you a design spec for the code that they're delivering. Those specifications should be maintained alongside your validation documentation as part of the package. And then you're going to actually get into your system development, configuration, customization, whatever it might be. Or you could be using an out-of-the-box package as is without any customization or configuration. In either event, or any event, you need to make sure you have some kind of specification if it's a configurable system, and some kind of specification if the code is being designed. You then move to installation qualification testing, where you're going to make sure the system is installed properly. After that, you move to operational qualification to assure that the functional code of the base package is working. And finally, you get to your performance qualification, where you're looking at it more from a user's perspective, and a user is actually executing it in a production simulated environment with production simulated test data. Finally, your validation report will summarize everything. It'll talk about how you did your testing, how successfully you met your plans in terms of your validation planning and your rationale for how much testing to do, and how well that succeeded. Note that every one of these has to be, the deliverable has to be approved before you can go to the next level. Now, there's a way that you can use your vendors and contractors to leverage them to reduce the time it takes to do your validation. A software package that is from a mature vendor is going to be one that's much more tried out in the industry and is known to be something with fewer faults and going to be more robust and mature in terms of the vendor's quality management system. So the vendor is more likely to be one that will conform to FDA requirements and will meet your own policies and procedures. But you have to audit your vendor at least every other year to make sure they are doing this. Your IQ and OQ test packages can be purchased from these vendors, and they can also execute them. This shortens the time for testing and preparing all the documentation, and that can be very lengthy. It also alleviates the need for your own resources to plan and execute these tests. And if you think that there are issues that are going to be coming up, the OQ is going to root out a lot of those. You're going to find deviations in your test scripts. You're going to find the software may not work as intended in some cases, and you're going to adjust things and have to do retesting as you go. And that's what makes it a lengthy process, and you never know exactly how long that's going to take because you don't know what things you're going to encounter. But make sure you include the cost in the budget for the IQ and OQ testing and packages if these are added into your project. Now, PQ has to be, again, performed by users. If you have external resources that prepare the scenarios and scripts, that's okay, but at the same time, user input is required. So they must have a way of interviewing your users to understand fully how they're going to use the system in their own environment. But then again, they have to execute the testing, your users. Now, the overall validation plan should be documented, and this is at the start of the project, and it should be reviewed and approved. The FRS and SDS should also be finalized, reviewed, and approved prior to completing your test protocol. Your test protocol should address every stage: unit and integration testing, IQ, OQ, and PQ. And there should be a formal test summary report at the end that addresses each stage. Now, some people like to put a summary report out and a test protocol out for each individual stage, and that's fine. But you can also combine them where it's a very simple system or there's very little testing involved, and you want to combine them all into one package. Either way is acceptable as long as you cover each stage. So again, the test protocol could be done for each, and each stage, though, must be executed before the next stage can be done. So you have to execute the IQ, get it approved, then you can execute the OQ, get that approved, and then you can execute the PQ. You can be working on the documents while doing other things, but the actual execution can't begin till the prior one from the prior stage is approved. And by approved, it's not just the protocol from the prior stage, it's the actual results and output of the prior stage. The summary report can come later on. Test protocols should include detailed procedures. So you start with your test cases and scenarios, which are your situations, your what would be going on in your particular area of work. Then scripts that are more specific that detail the steps to be taken for those cases. And also list out the expected results, and that should be based on acceptance criteria. So you might have a test case that says you want to collect results from testing in a laboratory. The scripts might have steps in them, or there might be individual scripts that have you logging into the system and setting up that particular run for testing. You might have a script that allows you to actually capture the test results. And then you might have some test scripts for some analysis or some reporting. The expected results for every step should be delineated next to the actual script. And there should be acceptance criteria. So the acceptance criteria may just be that it has to pass the expected results. They have to come, you have to get the expected results. But you might also have specific acceptance criteria, like the expected results have to be within a certain range, or your outcome has to be above something or below something. In all stages, the protocol for the testing should always be approved before you execute it. And execution should be completed and results approved before you prepare your test summary report. And that has to be approved before you can release the system into production. Once your summary report is released, users can prepare a system acceptance document. And this is after your IQ, OQ, and PQ reports have been, if they're separate, have been approved, or if it's one summary report for testing, it has been approved. You want then to do a system acceptance document. This says that everything based on testing has met acceptance criteria and the users accept the functionality as it is. Once the users accept the functionality, the IT organization or whoever is the steward of the system will issue a system notification of release. And this is saying to the users, the system is now in a production environment and you can use it. So when you prepare your test protocols, your IQ, your OQ, your PQ, you want to have a cover sheet, a signature page, make sure that every person's name who's a tester, reviewer, or approver is on that in a signature page indicating the signature of each person and the date and the meaning of each signature. So the page initially in your protocol will include the names of the people who you plan to have do these particular tasks, testing, reviewing, and approving. Approval also should be done, the last approval, by quality. You may have other approvers if that's required in your organization, but you should at least have one reviewer and one approver. And the reviewer and approver should be different people and different from the tester. You don't want to approve your own results or review them. Each person should sign it and date it, but the meaning of the signature is also important and can be highlighted on that signature page, because you want to make sure someone is reviewing it for a particular reason. They may be reviewing it for completeness or conformity to your procedure or for content, but whatever the case, they should be indicating that. And start with your introduction, background including the reason for testing. What does your system look like? Why are you testing it? And what rationale are you using in order to test it? Now, it's very simple for an IQ. You're simply proving that the system is installed properly. But in OQ and PQ, again, you get into your other more lengthy rationale for why you're doing the level of testing that you're doing. In the purpose, you want to set expectations for what you're trying to prove, so the reader can understand this is the whole reason you're doing this testing. Scope is important so that you include items and exclude items. You want to make sure it's clear exactly what you are testing and what you're not testing. Responsibility should be highlighted for every level involved in the effort. So again, you want to segregate duties. You'll have someone preparing the test scripts. You'll have someone executing them. You'll have another person reviewing and another person approving. Or you could have multiples of those. And it should be very clear, and you should have records on file for the people involved to assure that you have some degree of confidence that they are equipped to do the job that they're asked to do. So you want to have CVs or resumes on file, and you want to have any relevant training records also on file. Your system description is also important because you want to include the diagram of the system and components and the flow chart of the processes involved. This will be what you're basing your testing rationale on. So if your system and components are very simple, your testing is going to be much more streamlined. If your flow chart is simple, the same thing. But if these are complex, then you want to make sure that your flow chart is showing every process so that you are able to demonstrate you've taken everything into account in your testing. Your test procedure itself, the steps of the test scripts, these steps are required to complete your testing. Test data should be identified as what data you're including and what data you're not including. So you want to highlight which set of test data you're going to use for this. You want to make sure, at least in PQ, that that test data is a simulated version of your real data. And then you want to have notes on how you're going to test or what you're going to watch for, indicating how you're going to proceed. Your test results could be pass-fail, and it either meets the expected results or it doesn't. You could also have a specific result that you're looking for, and if it doesn't meet exactly that result, it fails. You want to indicate, too, if there's any deviation from expected results. Deviations are very important for tracking. There are three types of deviations that could result. It could be a system error, which is the most serious, where there's an actual glitch in the system or some kind of code error that has to be fixed. So when you are testing, if you come across a deviation that appears to be something related to the software, testing has to stop, and then you have to resolve that deviation before you can resume testing. Because of the change, you may also have to do some additional testing of things you've already tested to make sure the fix didn't interfere with other code. The script error is a simpler simpler case. Here, you might have a script that was written incorrectly. Maybe wording is wrong, or perhaps there's a step missing in your script. You have to rewrite that script and retest it. So correct the script error and test it according to the correction. Tester error is something where someone might execute incorrectly. Maybe they skip a step or they didn't put the right information in. It could be that they documented it incorrectly. Maybe it was something that failed, but they marked it as a pass, or vice versa. In any case, the test has to be re-executed to show that you did it correctly, and all of this has to be documented. And be careful never to throw away or delete or remove any of the documentation that you create during testing. Every single event, every single action you take must be documented at the time it is done, and you have to make sure you have some reason identified for errors that occur and how you resolve them. And you'll have a deviation log attached to your test scripts that will show each deviation uniquely identified, what was the purpose, what was the actual issue, what was the root cause, what was the resolution to it, and confirming that you were able to continue testing. Your revision history is important to make sure you know which version of the document is being used against testing. So you're going to have these documents as living documents. Over time, for example, you may do a set of OQ tests and then find out that there are some script errors or there are some problems with the system, and testing has to be modified. The test protocol has to be modified because the test scripts have to be modified. If that's the case, as you are going back and updating your test protocol and your scripts, make sure you add that version as a new version of the document in the history. You should have a history log showing each version and why it was changed. Test protocol reuse is very advantageous. So in other words, if you write a protocol for OQ testing and you execute it and you succeed, you want to have that on hand and always maintain it as current, because if you do any additional changes to your system, if you do enhancements, modifications, patches or upgrades that might affect functionality, you want to be able to pull up that test protocol and reuse it. So test protocol cases and scenarios will demonstrate the effectiveness of the system in a real business situation. The test case is how to be tested. It's a set of conditions or variables under which the tester is going to determine whether the application or one of its features is working correctly. The test scenario is what is to be tested, making sure that end-to-end functionality is working as expected. And this requires checking of all your business process flows. You have to look down every pathway that you can take in the system and have a test that follows that pathway. It requires your client to be giving the input, your user, your SME, making sure it reflects what they would be doing in an actual worker and working environment, how they would be using this particular application. And testing should also include positive and negative scenarios. So the positive scenarios show the system does what it's supposed to do. But a negative scenario is testing to make sure it does not do what it's not supposed to do. It should also include boundary and stress testing. Force the user to exercise the boundaries of the functionality and go beyond, try to go beyond what the system is supposed to do and see if it can. Testing should also demonstrate that the maximum use of the system isn't going to negatively affect performance. So if you have 20 users of a system, but you don't expect more than 10 to be on at any given time, you should at least test that 10 can work the system concurrently without degradation of performance. You might want to also go up and check, can 20 people do this? So at least you know what are the boundaries of your system. And now let's talk about some examples. So if you have a test protocol for a system used in your distribution channel, your supply chain, it might include the product or material specification, when it was manufactured, the lot and batch number, who handled it, showing chain of custody, and the environmental storage conditions. These are all things that will be included in your application as defined parameters or defined pieces of data. For an alarm system, you want to set the alarm at a certain level. You want to be able to change conditions to cause the alarm to go off. You want the specification for those conditions, how long the alarm is going to last and whether it's repeated, and the impact that alarm has on other processes. Does it trigger something else? In a lab, you may have sample identification, what method you're using to analyze it, the test instrument and environmental conditions, what procedure are you using for sampling, your sample specification, and your expected range of results. These are all components, requirements of your particular systems, and so these translate into test elements. Test scripts are the very specific procedural steps to be executed to support that test scenario. So for the lab example, you might ask the user to record the sample as a certain number and use a format that's required by your system. Now, if your sample number always has to be in this format, you should also have a test that looks at doing it with a different format, showing that it doesn't work. You want the specific temperature to be a certain degree, Fahrenheit or Celsius, either one, and the humidity to be recorded. You want the instrument serial number, and again, there may be a specific alphanumeric or other type of format for that. You want to set the instrument to a specific value, and then you want to run the test and manually verify results were recorded as output. You might also have an analysis step. Verify that the analyzed results are within that specified range of whatever it might be. So this would be your test script where you'd actually go in and run a test against a particular sample, against a set of environmental conditions, using an instrument with a serial number and a value set to something. And you're making sure the test not only can run, but you can verify the results were recorded properly, the analysis was done correctly, and the results are within your expected range. And you can also do parallel testing using a calculator to check your results and make sure they're correct. There are different ways that you might want to also check that testing is going well. Now here's an example of the test protocol and what you would have as your entry sheet for your test script. So you have a step number, and these all should be unique, and then you have a description, what you're actually expecting to be done, the expected results, and then the rest of it should be left as blank. You typically will print these out, give them to users, and make sure the users complete them properly. And they have to follow good documentation practices to do that, just as they would in any kind of lab, manufacturing, or other GXP area. So here, and this is printed, but it actually would be done by hand, the actual results, there's a failure, because the sample number didn't appear as expected in the field. So you fail the result, and you put a discrepancy number in. You sign it and date it. The next one is a pass. The expected result equals the actual results. And so you pass it, there's no discrepancy number, and you're initialing or signing and dating. Make sure that every single box or cell is filled in with something, whether that is not applicable or a diagonal line through the box, something to indicate it wasn't just missed. And also, it's not noted here, but where you put in N/A, make sure at the bottom, if you use any acronym, that you specify what that means. NA could be not applicable, it could be not analyzed, it could be any one of many things. You want to identify that in a footnote. Now here, perhaps the tester had a tester error, where they recorded the deviation number or discrepancy number as 5 when it should have been 6. And here they must note the incorrect number was entered. That's the reason for the change. The old value gets a single strike through it, the 5, and the 6 is next to it. And that has to be initialed and dated on the date on which the correction is made. So if you go back in time and do testing, and then a day or so later, you're actually looking at your discrepancies and looking at your discrepancy or deviation log and realizing you didn't do it sequentially, and then you have to go back and correct things, make sure you put in the current date, not the date on which the testing or the error was made. So every deviation or discrepancy from your expected result has to be assigned a consecutive number. It has to be investigated, and the reason for failure has to be determined through root cause analysis. You have to resolve it before you can move on. And it should be noted as one of those 3 types of errors we talked about: a tester error, a script error, or a system error. If it's a tester or script error, it requires you to retest to make sure everything is accurate and complete. But if it's a system error or a defect in the software, you must stop testing and you must resolve it. And that may require contact with the vendor or whoever is doing the coding and correction of that code. Afterward, you're of course going to test again and then continue with the rest of your scripts. Now, if a correction to code is going to have an impact on other parts of the code, you may actually have to restart your testing from the beginning or from some point. But you would have to determine that and write that rationale up as to why you're stopping here, why you're redoing any other testing that was already done, and how you're moving forward. And that should all be explained in your deviation or discrepancy log. Now, the vendor may also have to do some specific unit and integration testing if they're changing code. They should be able to test it again and make sure the new code is correct before they issue it as part of your system. If it has to be corrected, the entire testing process may need to be done from unit and integration testing by the vendor through installation testing and forward by the company. That's the worst case, where the code is changed to the point where everything has to be redone. You may actually have a new instance of the software that has to be installed in your test environment, and in that case, you have to follow and do the IQ for that for that software installation, and then do the OQ and PQ again. So it's important to try and do some trial runs on these types of tests. You can do trial runs in the beginning just to ferret out some of the test script errors, to get more familiar and avoid tester errors, and also identify any software bugs. Trial runs are fine. You don't have to document those. You can do them at any time before you start your formal testing. Once your defect is determined to be corrected, you have to record the resolution in the test deviation or discrepancy log and make sure that that is done before moving on. So all of your defects for a particular protocol must be resolved before you can finalize the test protocol summary report. And it also should be clear from your test summary report when any testing was stopped, what issues you analyzed and resolved, and you could reference the deviation or discrepancy log for that, and then when the testing was redone, and the chronological path followed should be detailed, making sure there's no misunderstanding as to any shortcuts you might have taken. You won't want to take those, and you don't want the documentation to appear as though you did. Any tester error should be noted and corrected immediately. And again, cross out the incorrect value with a single line. Indicate the reason for the change and initial and date it. So the test protocol and all of the results that you're capturing by hand always have to be done using good documentation practices. Now, you can do some of this electronically, but it's preferred that you do it by hand because it it makes sure that everything is authentic. You have to use a blue or black ink pen. Don't have any erasures, no whiteout, no crossouts or other marks obscuring the print. And every single cell or box that allows for a value or some information must be either completed, or there should be a diagonal line through it, or again, use NA in the field and define what NA means. And every page in your protocol has to stand on its own. So that means that it has to include each page, and usually in the header, the protocol number, protocol name, the page number as X page of N pages, and the protocol date. And if there is an electronic file name, that should be noted in the footer or header as well. You have to perform every step in sequence and record, initial, and date your results. Now, if there's a case where you don't have to do scripts in a certain sequence, if there's some that could be done at different times by different people, you want to divide the whole set of scripts amongst some different resources, that's acceptable, but you should note that as well in your test protocol in terms of your approach. Your completed results have to be reviewed by a second person and approved by a third person, usually someone in the quality organization. And again, segregation of duties is important, and it's also important to note the meaning of these signatures. Now, once your IQ, OQ, and PQ protocols are all done and executed, your results are reviewed and approved. Everything works successfully. You'll have a requirements traceability matrix prepared, an RTM. Now, this is an important document in your validation package. It's one that the auditors typically will ask for. And basically, you're recording the requirements and the design elements, and then the test elements corresponding to each. So you may have one or more test scripts for each requirement, but you have to have at least one. And you may have one or more design elements related to each requirement, but you have to have at least one. And in this document, you want to put down the actual functional requirement number, the number assigned to that functional requirement that's unique and identifiable. You want to have the functional requirement stated, and then in the next column, you would put in your design element, your specification, your number, which is again unique, and then you would have your design name or some description, and then the next column would be your test specification, what test script, what test step, and alongside that, a description of that test. Now, you may have a one-to-one-to-one correlation across requirements, design, and test script, or you may have multiple, in which case you would then repeat on the next line. It's the same requirement, but this is a different design element and a different test script. The RTM allows you to make sure that every requirement is documented as a unique one and that it's been tested thoroughly. So it's a very key document during audit because it will demonstrate that you took the requirements, you said what the system purports to do, and you can demonstrate that a test was done against each of those requirements to make sure it's met. Now, once the RTM is approved, then you're going to have a test summary report. The summary report can be done, again, separately for each phase or one for all three phases combined. If it's separately, then each phase should reference completion of the prior phase. The test summary report should lead a person to conclude that the system is ready to be put into production for use. All the scripts have been done accurately, all the defects identified and remediated, every issue has been resolved, and the documentation is complete and correct and it's in the appropriate chronological order. You also want to make sure that if some change to your system, your software, is such that it's going to require you to add requirements, delete requirements because you're not going to use those or those don't work, you want to make sure that you treat every one of these documents as a living document, and you go back and actually update your requirement specification to be current, and then complete your set of testing beyond that. And if you have to update your protocol, you have to version that as well. Same for summary report. Now, once your summary report's done and approved, now you're ready for system acceptance. And this is where you're indicating to the IT organization or whoever might be the system steward that you as a user or set of users believe that the system meets all requirements as stated. And then following that, the steward will issue a notification of release into production. This indicates the system has been moved to a qualified production environment and it's ready for use in your day-to-day operations. Standard operating procedures and templates are very important and support the whole process. For testing, the SOP should be developed and improved for IQ testing, OQ testing, and PQ testing. Now you might combine these into one set of operating procedures. Along with that, you want to make sure that you have some kind of procedures for developing and executing unit and integration testing of code if that's done in your organization. Other supporting SOPs would include those for good documentation practices and for computer system validation. And that should also, the validation SOP, address system categorization and risk assessment. Now, the SOP should also include templates as appendices. So for each of your protocols, you'll have a procedure in place for what has to be included, what the scope is, who would be executing it or creating the protocol. And then you also want to make sure that in the actual SOP, there's an appendix with a template that can be used to make sure that everyone in your organization is doing this work consistently. You want to have a template for your deviations or discrepancies and resolutions log, one for your requirements traceability matrix, your RTM, one for your system acceptance form, your notification of release form. All of these should be templates that can be reused across all of your systems and would apply fairly uniformly. And that gives the FDA a level of comfort that you are taking a very consistent approach to your testing. Now, training is very important because if your resources are assigned to develop test protocols, they have to understand how to do that according to the SOP. They also need to understand how to generate that test protocol, get it through the approval process, and they should know the documentation requirements for getting things approved before execution. If your resources are creating test scenarios, cases, or scripts, they should understand the functional area. There should be a subject matter expert. They need to understand, in particular with the PQ, how they're going to use this software in their environment to get the work done that needs to be done. The ones who are executing test protocols also should be adequately trained in how to execute testing and document it through good documentation practice training, and also should be functionally aware of what the system can do. If a resource is being used to review and approve test protocols or results or summary reports, They should be adequately trained for these respective roles. They should understand the test protocol procedure. They should understand what they're looking at, and they may even be experts in the system itself if they're looking as reviewers or approvers of results from testing. And periodic review is important for maintaining your system in a validated state. So over time, you may have changes to your system. You validate it, but through the year, you may have enhancements. You might have minor changes, cosmetic changes, or maybe a mixture of all of these. So you have to make sure the system is maintained under change control. And the change control procedure is another SOP that should be followed. Typically, an organization has a change control committee of some type that meets periodically and looks at requests to modify the system. And in doing that, they will determine which ones will or will not be included. If a change is approved, then under change control, you now have a case where you have to evaluate what that means in terms of impact on your test results. Is it just a cosmetic change where you just have to verify that a header on a report name is changed correctly? Or is it something more complex with a software change, maybe new functionality? New functionality would require you to add something to your requirements document and then testing to be comparable to the requirement that's being asked. In either case, you're going to have to update your living documents to make sure they're current. So everything has to be done under change control. These should be official documents that are controlled through a central resource. And every system should be looked at annually, because even if you haven't made a significant change in any one of those cases, you might have made a dozen or so minor changes, and you just feel more comfortable doing some retesting to make sure nothing that was changed is going to impact anything else. So this is where it's really more of a subjective point of view in what you think is needed and writing up your rationale for that in your retesting or revalidation documentation. Most changes will require some retesting, but some will require complete revalidation, particularly if you're going to interface your system to another system or if you're going to make major changes to coding. Your standard operating procedures should also be kept current. So if you have SOPs related to everything or anything that is something you're going to reference during computer system validation and testing, you want to make sure there's a current version of that SOP available. And there should also be training for new employees and for employees who maybe don't use the system as frequently and need a refresher. But there should be training available, and it should be logged and documented as GMP training or GXP training. The periodic review itself should be documented in a report that says when you did it, what you looked at, why you did any kind of retesting you might have done, or why you recommended no retesting is required, your rationale for that, and then a summary. So to recap, the first thing for testing is to make sure you have a good validation plan and that it's based on that system development life cycle, because you want to test for things not only in your current system as you validate it, but you want to maintain that system in a validated state and do any other ongoing testing as necessary as you make changes to the system. You want to identify the GAMP system category. Are you doing configurable systems, custom systems, or out of the box with no changes? That will tell you how you can do your testing. Identify the system risk. What if the system fails? Did you test thoroughly to make sure that every possible failure has been looked at? And did you have mitigation in place to counteract it? Based on all of that, you're going to determine the level of testing and validation that's required. And you want to make sure that every participant is adequately trained for the particular role that they're going to play. Are they developing test scripts, in which case they should be aware not only of how to do validation, but how to use the system as a functional expert? Are they going to execute the testing? Again, they need to know both those things. Are they reviewing and approving? And do they have the adequate credentials to be able to do that? And then you're going to prepare your test plan based on your validation plan, developing test protocols, scenarios, scripts, steps, and procedures for how you're going to test all of that functionality. You're going to execute that testing and resolve all of your discrepancies before completing the test. Generate a test summary report that talks about all the deviations and how they were resolved, and also indicates that the system is good to go. And then make sure that you revisit testing and validation as required as changes are made through formal change control. So with that, we'll have questions.